Mr. Speaker, will you please call the House to order?
The bill is passed.
We'd like to get a budget that represents the interests of the people who are standing here with me now.
To be part of the struggle to achieve a better society for all.
And that's why today I'm very pleased to cast my vote in the affirmative. Thank you.
Hello and welcome to Assembly Update. I'm Liz Koenig. The COVID-19 crisis had made it clear how debilitating a lack of broadband access is for many rural communities in upstate New York. Even before the pandemic, this was an issue in our rural communities. And joining me to discuss funding for a broadband access study secured in the 2021-2022 state budget is the chair of the Legislative Commission on Rural Resources, Assemblyman Angelo Santa Barbara, who represents the 111th Assembly District, which includes parts of Albany and Schenectady counties and all of Montgomery County. Thank you so much for joining us today, Assemblyman.
Thanks, Liz. It's great to be on the show, and it's great to be able to talk about this broadband study. It's something that's been in the works for quite some time, and now it's great to see that it's underway.
Can you elaborate a little bit on what challenges exactly people who have a lack of broadband access are facing?
Well, certainly this is a topic that's been talked about for quite some time. I know it's talked about in my communities here, and a lot of the rural communities of New York State have either poor access or in some cases no access at all. And the services we're talking about, just as we're doing the show on Zoom, we're using broadband. Virtually so many parts of our life at this point, of people's lives, everyday lives, depends on the being able to be connected to the internet. And certainly through the pandemic, that was highlighted. What we had been talking about was highlighted and on display, that people were trying to work from home. People were doing virtual learning at the high school level, but also at the college level as well. You talk about connecting with loved ones, being able to use things like FaceTime. Pretty much everything that we come across in our daily lives can somehow be connected to the internet, and whether or not you have access to high-speed broadband. One of the issues that's being discussed right now, of course, is the expansion of telemedicine. Having gone through the pandemic, that's something that was able to help a lot of people. That's something that was used more than we've ever used it before. And I think in the future, we'll see that some of these things will remain beyond COVID, beyond the pandemic. As we recover, some of these things will be just part of everyday life. So that's what makes this initiative so important, that we move it forward. These challenges are very real, and I think to be able to just function in today's world, pretty much everything we talk about, from education to healthcare, this has an impact on the quality of that service.
Now, has made several commitments to expanding access to broadband, yet there still seems to be a lot of work to be done. Can you explain some of the hurdles that you've faced and the state has faced in achieving 100%?
Yeah, there's challenges with getting broadband to some of these rural communities, some of the remote areas of our state. But the New York Broadband Program is what I point back to. That was a commitment to bring service to all of New York. Not just some of New York, not just the most populated areas of New York. As chair of the Rural Resources Commission, it's my job to make sure that we have the resources that we need in these rural communities to be able to recover from the pandemic, but also to have a quality of life, to be able to have the same. It shouldn't matter what zip code you have. You should be able to have the access to the same services. And it's my job to make sure that we're doing everything we can to fight for these resources, whether that's funding or legislation. In this case, it's a little bit of both. The legislation that we're talking about here today moves forward a broadband study that's going to identify these barriers. And these barriers range from a number of different things. And certainly geography is one of those barriers, but also, compliance with franchise agreements is something that's going to be in this study. Specific problems with underserved rural communities, the available technology, because sometimes it can be a number of different technologies, and there's always emerging technologies that can make things easier to bring service to these areas. But the point is, we need to know where, and we need to know the barriers, and we need to know what providers are out there. And to do that, we have to have accurate mapping. And that brings us to this piece of legislation that we're talking about here today, that actually can identify some of these barriers, but also give us a good idea of where the areas that are not served or underserved are, and what those challenges have been in the past. So New York Broadband made a commitment years and years ago. It's a promise, and it's a promise that the state needs to fulfill. I've written letters to the governor's office. This was something that he brought forward. It was a promise that the governor made, and he needs to fulfill that promise, and he needs to do that with resources. And the need for this bill is something that I was hoping we didn't have to do. I was hoping that that we'd have service in all of New York by now, but obviously that hasn't happened. But we need to find a way to make it happen, and whether it's funding, resources, legislation, a combination of all three, that's what we need to do to move it forward.
And can you tell what some of the goals are of this broadband access study?
Part of the issue that part of the problem with broadband mapping as it exists today is the FCC model determines a broadband service by census block, and census blocks are very large, and what the methodology that they use, which is what New York State has been using, is that even if one household is served in a census block that can have up to 1,200, hundreds of homes in it, they would consider that census block served. So it's really inaccuracy. The map is not showing what's reality. I know in my district, there are large parts of my district that don't have broadband service, but the mapping might show something different because of the way it's calculated. So what this study intends to do is to go beyond that and do new mapping that is more specific and not by census block. So with large census blocks, especially in rural communities, when you talk about these large census blocks, this is very problematic. That you can have a single household served in that whole census block has a check mark on it that there's service in that area. It's simply not true. The governor's claimed that 98 or 99% of 98%, I think was the number he used, that 98% of residents had broadband access was based off of that mapping. Obviously that mapping is flawed, and obviously that mapping is not something that's going to work for these rural communities. And again, as chair of the Rural Resources Commission, this is something we've had a hearing on, something that certainly we've pointed out as a commission, but we need to move this mapping forward to really get a real picture to be able to fulfill what New York Broadband was intended to do, which is provide broadband service to all of New York State, all the households, all school districts, all these areas that had problems during the pandemic, and that was highlighted. So it's reality that it's not 98%; it's much lower. In some communities, you may find that it's even, you may a very low percentage. As I said, in my assembly district, that number is much lower. I know because I hear from constituents, and across the state, you're going to find it's a very similar situation. So what this intends to do is have specific mapping that will go beyond that census block level. Use a more up-to-date method of calculating where areas have no service or are underserved or have slow speeds. There's going to be a lot of detail in this. Again, they're tasked. The Public Service Commission is tasked with completing this study, identifying barriers in addition to the mapping, the available technology, the providers, the franchise agreements. Are people complying? Are they able to deliver what they say they're going to deliver? And create a map that shows where there's insufficient access, and really creating that digital divide.
Now, the FCC has received federal funding to conduct a similar study. Why not wait until that study is completed?
Well, there was and that's part of the delay with this study is that the governor. This was a bill that was actually passed in both houses in 2020. The governor sadly vetoed this legislation which set us back to be able to even start the study, begin the study. It delayed the important work towards trying to find and eliminate these gaps in service. And the idea behind it was that there was federal funding coming at some point to be able to do this study, and maybe the state shouldn't go forward with it. We don't know when that federal funding is coming, but we don't know if and when. I know that it's been talked about. However, we have commitments. We have to move forward with the work that New York Broadband committed to do. We can't sit around waiting for federal funding if and when it comes. We just went through a very difficult year and a half here without this service. And when we talk about things like telehealth, we're talking about people's health care. We're talking about education, things that just simply can't wait. This should have been done years ago. And to say that we're going to wait now for federal funding down the road, that's just simply unacceptable. So this bill was sadly vetoed last year. As chair of the Rural Resources Commission, we pushed it forward to include it in this year's state budget earlier this year. It did make it into the budget. It was passed, and now what we're seeing is this study is moving forward. And despite the delay in this important work, I'm happy to see the progress is now being made, and that hopefully by this time next year we'll be able to move forward.
Now, when should we expect results from the state study?
The study is going to take some time to do. It's a lot of work. As I just said, there's a lot to this study, but there's a reason for it. We want to do this right. We want to make sure we have all the information we need to move forward. We want to make sure that providers are doing what they said they were going to do. In some cases, they may have to go back to areas they've already been through, because there are homes and communities that simply don't have service. Some of those communities have service, or parts of them, but certainly not all of them. So there's a lot that's going to go into this. It's going to be a detailed report. Certainly, it's going to be looked at by the Rural Resources Commission. It may involve further funding, further legislation that we need to make sure that this work is done, and it's done in a timely manner. We certainly don't want to go through what we just went through with the pandemic without communities not having access to these important services. Having broadband now is just part of everyday life. As I said, it's just as important as having any other utility, and I'll call it a utility, in serving your home. And I think at some point down the road, we got to think about that. This is something that is an absolute need in our communities. Our world is just changing that way. We're seeing more and more things go to a digital format. Businesses are doing more things online, serving their customers online. In the rural communities, even something that was talked about in the hearing is that even in farming, there are pieces of equipment that need to connect to the cloud and be able to upgrade, update their software. And so when you think about everything, including farming, which happens in a lot of these rural communities, anywhere from farming to schoolwork to healthcare, you can connect that in some way to broadband. It's just that important. So this study is going to take a little bit of time to complete. The good news is that we started it, but by the findings are due on May of 2022. So hopefully we can get that maybe sooner, but that's the deadline on when that is the PFC is required to deliver that to the legislature.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Assemblyman. We appreciate the update. We look forward to the results of the study, and of course, folks can contact your office. We'll have that information at the end of this program. So, thank you.
Great. Thanks for having
Good
me
to
on the show. Thanks for talking about this important topic. I look forward to joining you again soon.
Great. Thanks. Speaking with Assemblyman Angelo Santa Barbara, who represents the 111th Assembly District. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.